Hello, my name's Peter Crane, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the estate of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, which includes the unpretentious home of Paul and Bunny Mellon, their wonderful walled garden with its magnificent 60-year-old arbor, and fabulous formal greenhouse with this unique trompe-l'oeil painting. But the jewel in the crown of the Oak Spring estate is the Oak Spring Garden Library behind me here, created with great forethought and purpose by Bunny Mellon over the course of her very long life. Today, I'd like to introduce you to some of the treasures in the Oak Spring Garden Library and how they relate to the excitement around the exploration of plants during the age of Jefferson, and also to tease out some of the specific links to Thomas Jefferson himself. So please come inside and join me. The library was designed and constructed in two phases, according to the specifications of Rachel Lambert Mellon, to house her ever-expanding collection of books, manuscripts and art, mainly pertaining to plants, gardens and landscapes. In its external form, Mrs. Mellon and Edward Larrabee Barnes, her architect for the first phase of construction between 1976 and 1981, took inspiration for the library from rustic Portuguese farm buildings. Internally, though, the main central space is dominated by a magnificent Rothko, now a reproduction, but almost everything else in the library is an original, including this Dutch still life with birds by Birch dating from 1669, and this still life with a quince, two lemons and apple attributed to Cristoforo Monari from the early 18th century. The second phase of construction, between 1993 and 1997, with the Virginia architect Tommy Beach, created space for additional collections as well as for visiting scholars, and today is dominated by a massive oak table bathed in soft light where precious works can be set out for study. Behind the pickled oak doors in both the old and new wings are thousands of botanical and horticultural treasures from the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Also hanging in the main room of the library is a letter dated Monticello, April 3rd, 1814, in which Jefferson writes to David Gelston, who he had appointed collector of the port of New York in 1801, to thank him for his gift of pumpkin seeds, which flourished the principal fattening for his hogs grown for pork. Among the many treasures in the Oak Spring Garden Library is this spectacular work from 1561 by the 16th century physician, herbalist and naturalist Pietro Mattioli. Printed from wood blocks on blue paper and embellished with silver and gold, it integrates medieval plant-based medicinal knowledge with that of the classic Greek physician and botanist Pedanius Dioscorides from the 1st century. Remarkably, the library also contains a much later work from the 18th century by the French physician, botanist and engineer Henri-Louis Duhamel de Monceau that used exactly the same woodblocks from which Mattioli's work had been printed 2 centuries earlier. And even more remarkably, 4 of those blocks are still preserved in the Oak Spring Garden Library. Jefferson also had volumes by Duhamel de Monceau in his library, including this 1762 edition of A Practical Treatise of Husbandry. Jefferson had the 1762 edition, while the edition at Oak Spring is from 1759. Cross-referencing the holdings of Jefferson's library against that of the Oak Spring Garden Library shows that there are around 35 volumes in common, relating to botany, zoology, agriculture, landscapes and gardens, including identical editions of some classic works, such as the poem The Botanic Garden by Charles Darwin's grandfather Erasmus Darwin, and the 1785 to 1790 French edition of Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, to which Jefferson referred often. The same French edition is also in the Oak Spring Library, along with several other copies of the Gardener's Dictionary, including this volume with beautiful coloured figures. This entry is for quince, a fruit that Jefferson grew at Monticello along with his apples and peaches. Jefferson also owned a copy of the 1729 edition of Pomona, or The Fruit Garden Illustrated, by Batty Langley, which includes these extraordinary black and white illustrations of apples. The library also contains a rich collection of botanical works by other artists, many of them women, from Maria Sibylla Merian at the turn of the 18th century to Elizabeth Blackwell in the early 18th century, through to Margaret Mee and also Margaret Stones from the 20th century. But importantly for our purposes, the library at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation documents among its holdings the stories of plant exploration and introduction that characterized the age of Jefferson, the second half of the 18th century and the first 2 decades of the 19th century, and also Jefferson's abiding interest in the interconnected themes of botany and exploration. Botanical exploration in the 18th century was not only occurring in far-flung lands, but in what today we would think of as quite close to home. For example, Jefferson owned a copy of the Swedish naturalist Linnaeus's account of the plants of Lapland, which was based on his journey around the Baltic and to northern Sweden in 1732. Though hardly a region of high biological diversity, Linnaeus still described over 100 kinds of new plants. There are obvious parallels with the work of early North American naturalists such as Mark Catesby and John and William Bartram, who in turn are part of a lineage of North American naturalist explorers that continued with André and Francois Michaud and Jefferson's commission of Lewis and Clark. In his attempt to discover and classify the world's plants in Species Plantarum, Linnaeus's students travelled all over the world, including Peter Kalm, who travelled in North America in 1748 and 1751 and met both Benjamin Franklin and John Bartram, and then his student Per Osbeck, who travelled to China in the late 1740s and early 1750s, and also Carl Peter Thunberg, who travelled to South Africa and Japan between 1770 and 1779. All brought back new information and, in many cases, plants that had not been previously described. In North America, one of the great works of exploration, which is represented in both Jefferson's library and the library at Oak Spring, is the 1771 edition of Mark Catesby's classic The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which includes not only this extraordinary map, but also classic illustrations such as this magnificent painting of the southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, rendered for him by George Dionysius Eret, one of the greatest botanical artists of the mid-18th century, who also had collaborated with Linnaeus. On the left is Eret's illustration in the Catesby volume. On the right is the even more striking illustration by Eret in the Oak Spring Garden Library. Also important is that these works were not purely scientific, but also had strong links to the horticultural trade. Catesby, for example, was a major importer into Europe of horticulturally desirable North American plants, and this was also the nexus in which Jefferson himself thrived, that space where the beginnings of scientific botany, gardening, and the uses of plants come together. And Jefferson was especially curious, as he once said, to the properties and uses of plants. This quote, introduced to me by Peter Hatch, makes Jefferson's position very clear. I rank botany with the most valuable sciences, furnishing the principal sustenance of life to man and beast, delicious varieties for our tables, refreshments from our orchards, the adornments of our flower borders, shade and perfume of our groves, materials for our buildings, or medicaments for our bodies. Jefferson's strong utilitarian bent is seen among the works in his library and also at Oak Spring. For example, in this treatise by Duhamel de Monceau on the insect pests of grain, and also in this work by Parmentier, the great French popularizer of the potato, who Jefferson came across in Paris. Parmentier was largely responsible for the adoption of the potato as food for people rather than food for animals during the late 18th century, including during 1785, a year of bad harvests in northern France during Jefferson's time there. Jefferson's practical orientation is also evident in his notes on the state of Virginia, which is both a work of exploration and, as Gilbert Chenard said in his Jefferson biography, one of the first masterpieces of American literature. It is the first comprehensive treatise on the topography, natural history, and natural resources of some portion of the United States. In dealing with the plants, part of Jefferson's list seen here, Jefferson states, "A complete catalogue of the trees, plants, fruits, etc. is probably not desired. I will sketch out those which would principally attract notice as being 1. Medicinal, 2. Esculent, that is to say, edible, 3. Ornamental, or 4. Useful for fabrication, adding the Linnaean to the popular names, as the latter might not convey precise information to a foreigner. I shall confine myself, too, to native plants." Jefferson lists 129 plants, drawing extensively on Gronovius's Flora Virginica and commenting, "There is an infinitude of other plants and flowers, for an enumeration and scientific description of which I must refer to the Flora Virginica of our great botanist, Dr. Clayton, published by Gronovius at Leiden in 1762. This accurate observer was a native and resident of this state, passed a long life in exploring and describing its plants, and is supposed to have enlarged the botanical catalogue as much as almost any man who has lived." Jefferson owned the 1772 edition of the Clayton work, which also contains this fascinating early map. Clayton's work was published in Holland by Gronovius in 1743, and then again in 1762, and his specimens were consulted by Linnaeus, who named the flower we now know as Spring Beauty after Clayton, giving it the Latin name Claytonia virginica. This illustration is from the work of Benjamin Smith Barton, perhaps the leading American botanist during the later part of Jefferson's life. Barton authored the first textbook on American botany, assembled the largest collection of dried plant specimens in the US at that time, and also instructed both Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, and Meriwether Lewis in natural history. It was also Barton who named the twin leaf, which was first collected by John Clayton in the early 1700s and assigned by Linnaeus to podophyllum based on a non-flowering specimen. The first specimen seen flowering was collected by André Michaud and flowered in William Bartram's garden near Philadelphia in 1791, and it was named by Barton Jeffersonia diphylla in 1792. Jefferson was also well acquainted with William Bartram and his father John Bartram, and in July 1790 purchased a subscription to William Bartram's travels. Jefferson also proposed William Bartram as a botanist for the Lewis and Clark expedition. Among the drawings by William Bartram in the Natural History Museum in London is the first illustration of the Venus flytrap, which had been reported first in a letter from Governor Arthur Dobbs to Peter Collinson in London in 1759. William Bartram's drawing was probably made during a visit to his uncle's home on the Cape Fear River in North Carolina in 1761 and 1762. However, it was the English naturalist John Ellis who formally described this plant in 1770 and named it Dionaea muscipula, based on specimens that had been sent to London by Bartram's competitor, William Young. Among the treasures of the Oak Spring Garden Library is Ellis's original drawing and handwritten account of this remarkable plant, which is native to only a few counties in the low country of North and adjacent South Carolina. Not surprisingly, the flytrap was a sensation among the American plants that Jefferson requested during his stay in Paris in the 1780s, as he sought to illustrate the wonders of the American continent. Jefferson also tried to grow the flytrap from seed during his presidency and later also at Monticello. Another great botanical discovery of the Bartrams, Franklinia, a tree that is now extinct in the wild, named for Benjamin Franklin, was illustrated by François Michaud in his classic 3 volumes on North American forest trees, published between 1810 and 1813. In 1793, a decade before Lewis and Clark, Jefferson had asked André Michaud, François Michaud's father, to undertake a botanical exploration across Pennsylvania and down the Ohio River into Kentucky. That journey and other travels in the Piedmont and the mountains of the Carolinas formed the basis for André Michaud's classic work on the oaks of North America, published in 1801, which is illustrated with 36 exquisite engravings, 32 of them astonishing masterpieces of botanical art by Pierre-Joseph Redoute. An identical edition to that in Jefferson's library is in the library at Oak Spring. Nevertheless, it is the 138 magnificent images in his son's North American forest trees, printed in colour and finished by hand, that are seen more frequently and are still more iconic, such as these of the American chestnut and sassafras, or these of 2 magnolia species. These are classic illustrations of North American forest trees. Finally, I want to highlight one figure who was an almost exact contemporary of Jefferson, and that is Joseph Banks, who was also born in the spring of 1843 and died just 6 years before Jefferson in 1820. As noted by Lucia Stanton when she spoke at Monticello in April 1990, although Jefferson and Banks never met or corresponded, they were connected through their common endeavours, particularly exploration and plant introduction. 1768 was an important year for both Jefferson and Banks. It was when Jefferson began construction at Monticello, and when Banks, as a young man, departed from Plymouth on the 26th of August on the Endeavour under the command of Captain James Cook. This voyage, what we now call Cook's first voyage, included only the second contact of Europeans with New Zealand and also the first landing of Europeans in Australia. In the course of the expedition, Banks and his companions, Linnaeus' student Daniel Solander and the artist Sidney Parkinson, discovered more than 1,000 plant species that were previously unknown in Europe, including several now assigned to the genus Banksia, one illustrated here. On his return in 1771, Banks participated in only one further expedition, to Iceland, but based in London, he became a hero of the scientific community. He was elected president of the Royal Society in 1778 and became a trusted advisor to King George III on the royal gardens at Kew. It was Banks who set Kew on a path to becoming one of the world's most prestigious and influential botanical gardens. Jefferson was certainly aware of Kew, which he visited during his time in London in the spring of 1786. And Jefferson also owned a copy of Sir William Chambers' magnificent plans, elevations, sections, and perspective views of the gardens and buildings at Kew in Surrey, published in 1763, from which this engraving is taken, which shows 3 of Chambers' follies, the Alhambra, the mosque, and the pagoda, of which only the pagoda remains today. In the period between 1780 and his death in 1820, which coincided with Jefferson's time as minister to France through his post-presidency period, Joseph Banks, like Linnaeus and like Jefferson, directly instigated a series of expeditions with strong horticultural and botanical components. These included, for example, George Vancouver's expedition to the Pacific Northwest of North America, Alan Cunningham's travels to Brazil and Australia, and the voyages of Captain Bligh to transport the breadfruit from the Pacific to the Caribbean, in a ship significantly modified for the transport of many live plants, which perhaps helped precipitate the infamous mutiny. Like Jefferson, Banks also met Alexander von Humboldt, and Banks was instrumental in the botanical exploration of Australia, including through the Flinders expedition that included the botanist Robert Brown and the artist Ferdinand Bauer. This illustration from Flora Australasica, dating from 1827 and 1828, is based on plants grown in London by horticulturalists, but collected from seed in Western Australia. The illustration is one of the plants that Robert Brown named for his predecessor as Banks' librarian, Jonas Dryander. Also a Banks protege was the young William Jackson Hooker, who, like Banks, participated in an expedition to Iceland. On the death of Banks in 1820, the ascension of Queen Victoria to the British throne in 1837, and the transformation of Kew from a royal estate into a national botanic garden, William Hooker, seen in this profile, in 1841 became the first director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And Hooker was not only a remarkable botanist, but a very accomplished artist. His Pomona londinensis, published early in his career in 1818, includes beautiful illustrations of several of the fruits very familiar to Jefferson, including this of the greengage plum, the yellow Antwerp raspberry and Moorpark apricot, and the Mayduke cherry. All were grown by Jefferson at Monticello, just a few of the hundreds of varieties of more than 100 plant species that were part of Jefferson's world. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this brief insight into the Oak Spring Garden Library and how it connects to the excitement around plant exploration during the age of Jefferson. And I hope you'll stay in touch with us here at Oak Spring and visit our website at osgf.org.